In this exercise, we're going to be creating a very basic flyer in InDesign just to get the hang of how the program works. The flyer has to be created in 8.5 by 11, which is letter size. So let's go ahead and grab the print preset at the top and then select letter. I'm also going to change my units to inches because that's the way that I prefer to work, and turn off facing pages. Since this is just a flat flyer, there's no like inner spine or binding that is going to cause this to be a facing pages situation. Underneath that, we also have a bunch of other settings for columns and margins and bleeds. Okay, let's just go ahead and set this up how we think it's going to be set up, and then we can always change it later. So I'm going to put in 3 columns. I'm going to change the column gutter to 0.25. Then let me raise my margins to 1 inch. And then for bleeds, I'm going to increase all of them to 0.125 inches. And since I have this little link checked, it makes it so all 4 are the same for all these. Okay, then let's go ahead and click Create. So once we're inside of the document, you can see that it set us up exactly how we asked. We have a 1-inch margin all around. Okay, so the zone between the inside of this purple area and the outside of the page is the margin. And then on the inside of the margin, we have 3 columns with a 1/4 inch gutter between each of the columns. So that's exactly how we asked it to set up. Then on the outside, we have this red line. Okay, that red line is 1/8 of an inch past the edge of the page, and that's for our bleed. So if we want to have any art that extends to the edge of the page, we need to make sure to extend it a little bit further so that it covers that bleed section. If we want to make any changes to this, we can always go up to Layout and down to Margins and Columns. Okay, and this will allow us to make adjustments to the things that we just put down. Okay, so let's actually turn our margins down a bit because I think 1 inch is maybe a little too much. So let's go down to 0.75, and we'll keep the columns at 3. But you can see that if we make adjustments to this, it's going to change what happens inside the document. And if you're not seeing that change take place, it might be because you have preview turned off. Okay, so make sure that's checked so that you can see what's going on as you make those changes. Okay, let's go ahead and click OK. Then if we go to File and down to Document Setup, this is where we can actually make changes to the size of the page and also our bleeds. So if we decide that we don't want bleeds anymore, we can always zero that out to get rid of them. Okay, let's leave bleeds at what they are though. Okay, so for this exercise, I want you to create a flyer for some kind of event. It can be any event you want or a made-up event. I'm going to work on a made-up event called the Flower Lab. Okay, and one of the requirements is that you have at least 1 image, then also 3 different pieces of text that all work at different hierarchies. Okay, so you can have as much text as you want, but at least 3 different levels of hierarchy within the document. All right, so let's go ahead and pull in this image. I've got the image I want to use in this folder, so I can click and drag that into the document. And when I regain focus on InDesign, it's loaded into my cursor. So now I can go ahead and click and drag. Okay, and the snap is kind of fighting me a little bit, so you might need to fight it to get it to line up to that bleed. I'm going to extend it past the edge of the page to that bleed section. All right, and then let's go ahead and click on the middle of the document because I want to make this a bit bigger, but I want to leave the bounding box of the image the same. So if I click this little circle, I get the brown edge. Okay, so that brown edge indicates that I'm changing the size of the image itself. So now when I resize this, and I'm holding down Option, by the way, to resize this from the inside out. But if I hold down Shift, I'm also going to constrain the image proportions, which is really important. Okay, so now I can resize that. You can see it makes the image larger, but it's leaving the frame the same. If I wanted to adjust the frame, okay, I would just not click this center section and instead click the other parts of the image to get the blue frame. And that would allow me to adjust the actual crop of the image. Okay, but in this case, I wanted to make the image itself a little bit larger. All right, and then again, if you click W, okay, this toggles between the preview mode and the regular mode, which allows you to see what your document actually looks like, which is really good to see because sometimes all these guidelines can really get in the way and it's hard to design when you're trying to work within all of those kind of extra lines. Okay, so that looks pretty good. It's a good image for the Flower Lab. By the way, I found this on Unsplash. Just make sure that you find images that are high enough resolution. You can always check your resolution in the links panel. Okay, so if I select this photo and go to the links panel, there's a bunch of information that it gives me. And you can see that the dimensions of this photo are 3000 by 2000, or actually more than that. So it's a really big image. And then there's also this number that says effective PPI. And generally speaking, you want that to be above 300 for print. Okay, so since my effective PPI is 353, that means that my image is large enough for what I'm using it for. And you can see as I change the size of this image, so if I scale this up, that effective PPI is going to go down, because that's telling me that now I'm dipping just under 300, which is still maybe okay since I'm right on the border, but you definitely don't want it to go that much further than that. Okay, so that effective PPI is calculating what the density of pixels are in the image based on the size that it's placed. So if you have a really small image, that effective PPI is going to be really small, and that's going to cause pixelation when you print. Also, if I resize this and don't hold down Shift, okay, now you can see that the effective PPI isn't one number, it's actually two numbers. That's because I'm squishing the pixels. So in the horizontal direction, my PPI is lower, but in the vertical direction, my PPI is higher because I've actually squished the image. So if you ever see those numbers not being the same, or if you ever see these sort of two numbers, that means that you squish the image, and you want to make sure that you're not doing that. So let me undo that so that I go back to just one number. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let me go ahead and collapse that links panel, and let's go ahead and add in our piece of type. Okay, so I'm going to grab the type tool and drag out an area, and let's type in the Flower Lab. That's the name of our event. Then we can select that, hitting Command A to select all, and then we can go to our character panel and just choose a font that we want. Let's go with Avenir. Okay, and we'll go with Avenir Next Bold. And then, you have control over your weights under the second drop-down menu. Let's go ahead and scale our type up. Okay, we also have control over our leading, although in this case, since we're working with one line, it's not going to matter. And then we also have control over our tracking. So if I want the letters to be spaced out further or spaced in a little closer, I can change that value. By the way I'm working with these, and one of the ways that I like to work best, is by just putting my cursor inside this region. And if I use the up and down arrows, I can make adjustments to this. And I find this to be a little bit more fluid than like typing numbers in or using the drop downs. Okay, so we'll go ahead and leave that at 0. All right, so when I resize this bounding box, you can see it's actually resizing the actual type area. If I want to resize the type on its own, I actually have to hold down Command, okay, and then when I drag out, it's going to resize that type. But I want to make sure I'm also holding down Shift so that I constrain proportions. And if I don't hold down Shift, let's say I do something like this, you can see the type is going to get really squished. And in the character panel, it reflects that because the vertical scaling's at 100%, the horizontal scaling's at over 400%. So that's telling us that we've really skewed the type. So let's go ahead and undo that. And then if I want to resize, I'm going to hold down not only Command, but also Shift to make sure that that stays proportional. All right, and if you ever find that you have too much of a box, for instance, this box doesn't need to be this big, and sometimes when things are like that, they can kind of get in the way. You can always double click on sort of this bottom region, and that'll kind of tidy things up and it'll bring it back so that it's the exact height of the actual type inside. So that's a good thing to do to just kind of clean things up. All right, I want to get this centered, so let's go ahead and hit W to bring back our guides. And one thing I could do is sort of like resize this and get it so that it's fitting right into our margin. Okay, and then if I go to paragraph, I can align this to the center so that the type is aligned in the middle. I could also use the align tools. Okay, so if I select this and bring it out of alignment, okay, over here you have some tools for alignment. And if I click center, okay, it's going to center that, and it's going to center it based on what's happening over here. So if you click that and nothing happens, it might be because you have it aligned to selection. Okay, so when I select align to selection there, when I click center, it's not actually doing anything. And that's because align to selection will align it based on the other thing that's selected. So now with two things selected, it's going to align them together. Okay, but if you want to align it to the page or align it to the margins, you actually have to click this little drop down and change what you're aligning it to. So if I align it to the margins and click center, it's going to center it within that margin area, which is what I want. Okay, so let's go ahead and change the color of this. This is another thing that's a little bit different in InDesign. Let me collapse the paragraph panel. Okay, so you do have a color picker up here, and you have the stroke underneath, and then at the top you have the fill color. Okay, but if I change the fill color to, let's say, this cyan, see that it actually filled the box rather than the type itself. Okay, and that's probably not what we were expecting. So let's undo that. And the secret is that you have to click this little T in order to select the type. Okay, so if you want to change the type color, you actually have to click that little button, and then anything that you change will actually change to the type itself. And the same is true for this area over here. You have the fill color for the box, and this is the container, or the actual type itself. Okay, so if I want to change that type, I have to select the T, and then when I click on this, I get a color picker, and I can choose a color I want. Let's go ahead and make this sort of a rosy red color. There we go. All right, so that looks good. Let's go ahead and add another piece of type underneath this. Okay, so I'm actually going to hold down Option and click and drag to copy this. And let's change this font to something much smaller. Okay, and I'm actually going to change the font to Chronicle. And let's use Chronicle Deck Roman. There we go. And then let's just go ahead and change the size way down. We'll make this 18 points. And I'll change the leading as well to 30 points. Okay, there we go. This will be sort of my subline. Okay, so let's go ahead and type in what we want to type, which is learn how to use science to create beautiful arrangements. Okay, so that's sort of the tagline. Let's go ahead and style that how we want it. And maybe I'll actually try the italic version. I think that might look kind of nice mixed with the sans serif. Okay, and that's nicely centered with our type. And then we can just sort of move that up. Okay, one thing that you want to do when you're working with colors is to work with actual swatches. So if I click on this piece of type and I go to the color picker at the top where I have my swatches and I select my text, okay, you can see that my text is filled with that color, which is what I want. But if I go ahead and change this color to something else, let's say I change it to red, okay, it's only going to change that piece of type. But in a lot of cases, you actually want to have a swatch populate through a bunch of different pieces. Okay, so let's undo that and go back to that color. And this time, instead of just changing the type, I'm actually going to click this little button to create a new swatch. Okay, so you can see that it put a new swatch underneath all the other swatches. And this swatch is named with the actual color values. But I can double click on that and name it with something else if I want to. So if I unclick name with color value, I can name this, brand red. Okay, and now in my swatches, I have that color of brand red. Okay, so now if I take this secondary piece of type, and again, I have to click on the little T to make sure I'm changing the color of the type itself. Let's go ahead and select brand red. Okay, now both of these are sort of aligned to that swatch. And if at any time I go ahead and change that swatch, so if I double click on this and change it to make it a little bit brighter, okay, you can see it's actually changing both of those values at once. So this is a little bit of a cleaner way to work, and it's a good thing to keep in mind, especially if you're working with a big document with a lot of pages. Swatches are usually preferred over just singular colors because it'll keep things tidy, and if you ever need to make some sort of global change, it'll happen really seamlessly. All right, let's go ahead and give a background color to this. And I think it's actually interesting to maybe only extend the background color part of the way up. Okay, so let's hit W to go ahead and show all of our guides. We want our background color to extend all the way to the bleeds. So I'm going to grab the rectangle tool, and then let's go ahead and draw our rectangle. Okay, and this background color is too dark. So let's go ahead and take off the stroke, which we don't want. Okay, and then let's go and create a new swatch. Okay, so this is going to create brand red copy, but we're going to change that. Okay, and I want to make this sort of a pale color. There we go, sort of a creamy kind of pink color. There we go, I think that looks good. And let's call this background and click OK. So now we have a new swatch for that background color. All right, and just like in other programs, you have some different layers. Okay, right now everything is in one layer, but there's a stack of different objects that are grouped or sorry, layered in different levels. So if I take this rectangle and drag it underneath the other items, you can see now it's behind them. And if I drag them on top, now it's in front. So that works similar to other programs. And just like other programs, you can also use the hotkeys. For instance, Command Shift open bracket is going to send it to the bottom, and Command Shift close bracket is going to send it to the top. And then if I don't use Shift, just Command bracket, it'll send it down one layer at a time, and close bracket will send it up one layer at a time. Okay, so this works exactly how you expect. I'm going to layer it here so that it comes sort of above the flower label, but below the type. And then let's go to our effects panel and change the blending mode to multiply. Okay, so again, this works pretty similar to other programs. If you go to effects, you do have that drop down for all of your different blending modes. All right, so now when I click the W key, you can see I've kind of created this background, and it's actually a little bit dark. So let's go into our swatch, and I'm going to make that color just a bit lighter. There we go. So it's a very pale color. All right, that looks good. And I like the effect of it not coming all the way up the flowers. Just a little bit more interesting. All right, cool. So let's move this stuff down, and then let's just put in our last pieces of information. And these pieces of information I'm going to align to the grid. Okay, so let me grab the type tool and just sort of align this. And one thing to note is that if I click on this rectangle, you can see that the type tool actually has like a circle around it. So what that's saying is that when I click, it's going to put the type and use the sort of rectangle as the box. So remember how we talked about rectangle frames? This rectangle for the background is going to work in a very similar way. So if I click, it's actually going to put type sort of in the box, which is not what I want. Okay, so let me undo that. And instead, I have to make sure that I'm clicking and dragging so I'm not putting type in the box, but I'm actually creating a new frame for that type. All right, so here let's sort of put all the information for our event. I'll zoom in a little bit, and then we'll put location, and this will be San Diego City College. Okay, and then let's go ahead and style this a little bit. So let's go to character, and we'll change this to Avenir. We'll use Avenir next, bold. And then maybe what I want to do is change the location to a lighter weight. So I'm going to change that to regular. Okay, and then I'll select everything, and let's just bring that down in size, and maybe expand the tracking a little bit. Okay, and then we can also expand the leading. Okay, so the default will always give you a certain percentage of leading, but it's good to change from that default. So let's go ahead and change that to 11. All right, and that looks good. And again, press W to toggle that on and off is a really good way to see kind of what you're doing. All right, so that looks good. Let's go ahead and tidy up the bottom of that, and then just bring it down to our margin. And then I'll make copies of that for our other pieces of information. Okay, so maybe we have the date / time. And by the way, you can see that it's sort of creating sort of these rectangles out of the type. And again, this is another way that InDesign works fast, is sometimes it does what's called Greeking of the type. And that's if the type is really small, it may sort of change it to a rectangle. So you can see if I zoom out, that small type actually turns those rectangles, and that helps InDesign work faster. So if you're working in a document that has a ton of really small type, it's actually not going to render all that type, which is going to help it not get bogged down. But if that happens to you, don't worry. If you zoom in, okay, that type is still there. It's just that you have to hit a certain level of zoom for InDesign to decide to render it. All right, so date and time, let's change this to February 22 at 8:00 p.m. All right, and then let's put price, and for the price, let's put general $15, students free. All right, cool. So now we have our finished product here. It looks pretty good. You know, like I said, just make sure you have 3 different levels of hierarchy. So I have this level of hierarchy, I have this level of hierarchy, and then I have a different level of hierarchy for my information. And you could even argue that I have a 4th level of hierarchy because this is sort of a subhead for this information. Okay, so there's actually 4 levels of hierarchy in here. Make sure everything is nice and tidy. And then also make sure that your links are enough resolution. So again, those should be at least 300 or close to 300. Otherwise, when you print this, it's not going to look good. Okay, and then lastly, just make sure that all of your artwork is, if it's supposed to be the edge, is extended to the bleed. Okay, so if I zoom in on this, you can see that that background is extended all the way to that bleed. So just make sure that you have the same. Okay, and then the last step that we need to do is to actually export this. So let's go up to File and Export. Okay, and then let's go ahead and choose the folder that I want for the flyer exercise, and then we'll call this the Flower Lab. Okay, and then there's 2 different PDFs that you can export. One is interactive, and the other one is print. Print is if you want to actually output this for print, whereas interactive is if you want to export it for looking at it on the screen. So let's go ahead and choose print. And then the rest of these settings you can leave at the default of high quality print, except that you want to, under marks and bleeds, check use document bleed settings and also check crop marks. Okay, so that's going to give you those crop marks so that your final image has the markings for where to trim the document. So let's go ahead and check those 2 things and then click export. All right. So then if we go to our folder here, you can see that we've created this PDF, and the PDF is ready to go for print, including those bleeds and the trim marks, which have been marked. So that's it for this exercise. Definitely get creative with your event and the way that you lay out your document, but keep it pretty simple. The goal of this assignment is really just to get used to the basics of how InDesign works.